The universe is defined as everything that was, is, or ever will be. But is it? That is the age-old question that has been asked in many different forms over the millennia. Is there something outside of our experience, outside of the universe? This question can be asked many ways. Is there a multiverse? Is the universe a simulation? Is there a God? Is there something that we simply cannot comprehend? My guest today ponders those questions on his YouTube channel, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur, along with what lies ahead for humanity, or even speculations about what alien civilizations might be like.
Welcome to Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's special episode, John is joined by longtime friend Isaac Arthur, host of Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. A physicist and futurist, Isaac explores the possibility and the future of humanity on his channel, and also speculative looks at what alien civilizations might be like, science fiction, and of course explorations into the possible solutions for the Fermi paradox.
Welcome everyone to Event Horizon with me, John Michael Godier. If you enjoy what you hear, fall into the Event Horizon, hit the like button, and become an active subscriber by ringing the bell. Isaac Arthur, welcome to the program, or welcome back to the program, actually.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Isaac, I have a question that I've been dying to ask you for some time now. What is your take on simulation theory?
Well, that's actually kind of an interesting one because I have the long-standing opinion that regardless of whether the answer turns out to be, and I don't think we'll ever be able to determine what that answer is, the question isn't whether or not we live in a simulation, it's whether or not it actually matters if we live in a simulation. But the basic concept of the simulation hypothesis often gets misstated. It's not a question of whether or not you live in a simulation, it's whether or not you live in something very specific called an ancestor simulation. An ancestor simulation is where you're simulating either your own past history or something really close to it. And that differs from just any simulation because in there, you'd actually expect the universe to be a lot like the one the simulators were in. So you can actually tell a little bit about what the simulators were like. If you think of an old Nintendo game where you could walk off the right-hand side of the screen and emerge on the left, that's not like on our reality. That's a simulation, though. If you're trying to simulate your own past or, like a minor variation like what if World War II started 3 years later or what if the Cold War had never happened, you don't do something like that when you've mucked around with the basic physical constants of the universe or its size. You're trying to make something that is as much like your past as possible. And you might do a simulation where you tweak the speed of light just a little bit higher or lower, but you're aiming for something really similar with one or two minor differences at most. And that means you can actually tell a little bit about what the simulators are like. And that's important for when we try to talk about how realistic it is that someone might simulate us. Because the simulation hypothesis suffers from what we call the principle of indifference. So I shouldn't say suffers, but the principle of indifference is when you got options you can't tell anything about at all. You don't know what's more likely or not, like Coke or Pepsi. I know most people like one of those two drinks, and it's probably about 50-50. So I'll just say it's 50-50 till I know better and can run some stats. We have no way of checking what the probabilities are on that, so we say principle of indifference. There are three options that make sense for the simulation hypothesis. One, civilizations can never figure out how to do it. They either die off or it's not doable to simulate people that accurately. Two, they can do it, but they really don't for some reason. Or three, they can and they do it all the time. And so each of those is a 1/3 chance, not because they actually are, but because we don't know what the odds are, so we figure they're all equally likely. 3 options, 1/3. And then you say, then my odds of being in a simulation are just under 1/3 because there's always the chance, no matter how many simulated realities there are, that you're in the actual real one. So in that regard, you've just under 1/3 chance, a 33% chance that you live in a simulation. But that's not what's taken out of nowhere. There's no empirical evidence of that probability. So then you have to start looking at how can we ever go about figuring out what those odds are? We have no way of measuring those because we can't hack our way out of the simulation. We're not a brain in a vat. They can come in and edit what kind of code we have, so we don't even notice the inconsistencies. Somebody says, oh, look, I've noticed I'm in the matrix, and they just pause it and go to the last stable save or delete it out so you go, oh, I was having a bad day, I was drunk, and then you just forget the entire event. That's the kind of power you have when you can code the simulated universe as opposed to just having a brain in a vat. So you're never really going to be able to actually figure out if you're in one, unless they decide to let you know, right? You can't internally discover it because they'd have to make a really big mistake, and they can edit those mistakes out. They can pause it and go back and move them. And they're obviously very good at it because they're simulating entire universes. So without being able to ever find out, one has kind of asked the question, does it matter? We've always assumed there were higher realities. That's a long-standing part of our various mythologies and theologies down the years. There's a higher plane of existence. We never doubted whether or not that made us real or not. We weren't fake just because there was something above. And I think the same applies with the simulation hypothesis, too. Whether or not we are a lower layer of somebody simulating us, I'm still me, even if I'm on a computer. Neurons, computers, whatever it is, I'm still me.
You said something that piqued my interest particularly. That we could learn something about whoever is simulating the universe. Could you go deeper into that? What could we learn just based on how the universe is set up?
I'm using that Nintendo example before. If I can walk off the right-hand side of the screen in the simulation and pop up on the left, in that NES game, it doesn't tell me anything about our world, the one that created that Nintendo game. If it's an ancestor simulation, because they're trying to do something like their own universe, their own history, it's very close to your own reality. If it's going to differ, it's going to be in one thing, and you might not be able to tell what that one thing is, but you can make real guesses. One of the reasons why you might not simulate people is because you have to get rid of all that heat, build up waste heat, all that things like that, and no matter how prosperous society is, there's a cost of energy that you care about. There's a limited finite number of resources in our universe. And in an ancestor universe, an ancestor simulation, that means the simulated universe has that same thing, because a universe without entropy isn't very like the one we live in, so it's not an ancestor simulation. If we're in a simulation by somebody who doesn't have entropy, or who has infinite energy, or who doesn't have to follow conservation of energy, we don't know anything about their limitations. It's a completely different universe, completely different rules. So it's only in the ancestor simulation context that you can really guess at anything about their structure. As an example, if I'm going to simulate a universe, I'm not going to simulate a universe as big as ours if all I want to do is look at Earth. That's excessive. Only if I need to look at the 20th century would it even come into play so they could have normal astronomy. If I'm trying to simulate the 15th century, all I simulate is a relatively closed box system, and the stars are all fixed in place because they're not going to think about it then. And I don't want them to think about it because I don't want them to try to peer outside that area and require me to simulate more. So we can never know what the simulating layer above us would really be like for sure, but if we're assuming it's an ancestor simulation specifically, then we can make some pretty good guesses about what their universe would be like. And that is the big difference between them and just, is this all a dream?
Now, with the ancestor simulation, though, that bears implications because that presumably, now this is an assumption, but presumably means that we are humanity in the future simulating our history, ourselves, our ancestry. But could it simply be that we are a byproduct of an alien civilization's ancestor simulation, where they simulate the universe as it was for them, and we just happen to be here, and that our actual simulators are an alien species? Is that reasonable to say that, or is that just crazy talk?
Not in the ancestor simulation context. For the most part, not anyway. If I want to simulate 20th century Earth now, assuming I have the computer processing around, since that processing does cost me power, all those other stars are very minimal. I'm simulating them to exactly the degree necessary to make them look realistic to the people on simulated Earth. So it's not like I'm not simulating every atom, for instance, in a simulation period. If I'm doing something, again, for a 15th century one, I certainly am not, simulating individual molecules, because I don't need to, because they don't have microscopes. And so I don't have to worry about them looking and saying, what's up with that? If you're only simulating a planet in the sense that it's a physical object they can make out as a hazy blur, why would you simulate that to such a degree that it actually had intelligent life on it? That's a lot of overkill. And you can usually assume that people aren't going to engage in that much overkill without, a reason for it. You're not just doing it on a whim. So I don't think we could be their byproduct unless they were, say, specifically trying to simulate their own ancestor simulation for when they became a galactic empire, and Earth was part of that interaction when they got to, they came by and invaded us, and we became, at that point, we're kind of part of that ancestor simulation. So we wouldn't be an accident or byproduct, we'd be on purpose, because they need to have us realistically there. But even then, why would you ever simulate us before we actually came into play? They can just start with whatever degree of resolution they need and start at a year or so before tops, before they arrived or heard from us. They don't need to simulate us so that they can get the signal out, they can just repeat the signals they received originally from hearing from us, for instance. So you never, the thing about an ancestor simulation is it could have started a minute ago, and the memories are just uploaded. You don't bother running through the perturbations until you actually get to that point where you're trying to, whatever your motivation is for a simulation, you only turn the simulation on at the point where that's going to start diverging and being of interest,
Now, did you read the recent paper, and I forget the authors, it was about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years, where they calculated that we can't create, as humans, we can't create an ancestor simulation. It doesn't mean that someone else couldn't in another universe, but that we can't do that. Are you aware of that?
I remember that one, and I want to be careful because I don't remember it too well, because the first one that's going in my head is that was a very badly done paper, and so it might not be the same one, and it's just lose my head even if it is the right one. I don't want to be unfairly besmirching them if it was a good paper, but
Sure.
I remember somebody doing, either I read the paper or saw an analysis of it that I disagree with strongly. If I can simulate a human brain, which only requires presumably about 10 to 16th hertz, we think right now, which we already do with supercomputers, then I can do an ancestor simulation, because an ancestor simulation doesn't necessarily assume that everybody in it is conscious. I'll give you an example. We say you have a motivation for doing ancestor simulation. There are not very many good ones that really hold up. One of those is that you want to raise children, right? You're in an advanced civilization, it's post-scarcity, and you don't want all these kids being spoiled. We were talking earlier about, virtual worlds, that everyone might get spoiled and hedonistic. You want to give them that instilled core of ethics and hard work, for instance, right? So they don't turn into lazy slobs. So you might raise them in a period like ours, where things are pretty advanced, and all that reason and stuff is in place. They could shift into that other culture, but not so advanced that they'd be wondering if they were in a simulation constantly. Most of the people would think that everything is real and fine. And so this is a pretty good period, probably, because it's probably the last generation or two before that's going to be one of those omnipresent ideas that you could be in a simulation. And in a case like that, one of the ways you say is, well, if they're trying to raise me to be a member of their society, how do you account for all the folks who have truly horrible things happen to them? And, that classic problem evil thing. And, well, of course, they could just remove the more traumatic bits. They might be master psychologists or just delete that part out. But then you don't know that those people necessarily are real like you're real. They could just be, all you know is that you're real, and maybe the people nearest you are real. And so unless you yourself have had something happen to you personally that would say, this could not possibly be a simulation designed to raise me to be part of, a more advanced civilization that's simulating me, you don't know that those other folks are actually real, so you don't know that breaks the model for that. The concern there being, you could have a simulated planet. It's not hard to simulate a planet, right? We do this all the time already in games. To a certain degree of resolution, you only have to model the parts that you can actually see yourself. And even if somebody gets in, it's like, well, I carefully measured this one atom's position, ignoring quantum for the moment, and I went back and looked at the next day. And I said, well, and it was in the same place. They had to have been simulated the whole time because it's in the same place. It wasn't randomly generated procedurally or something like that. I'd say, well, no, because you don't know that that's what actually got measured. You only know that you think that's what got measured, Because, again, you're not a brain of that. They could just pause it and say, every time he sees an inconsistency of this sort, it sets off a red flag. We pause it, and we delete that red flag. All is consistent now.
Now, the one thing I want to ask you about, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that surrounds this subject that's related to what we're talking about. The anthropic principle. Could you give me your view on the anthropic principle?
Oh, sure. The simulation hypothesis is actually one of the three big ones used for the anthropic principle as an example. The other two being the doomsday argument and a fine-tuning argument for the universe, fine-tuning theory. The anthropic principle is different from the mediocrity principle or the Copernican principle that we're all used to. But we actually do both of these all the time. The examples are just a little bit less obvious because we always use mediocrity in science. The Copernican principle, or the expanded version being the mediocrity principle, is to assume that anytime you see something, when you're new to that and it's a new object, that it's probably a mediocre example. It's in the bell curve. You know it's not going to be exactly in the middle, but most of those traits it has are probably normal for what it is. And that's a very good approach from a scientific perspective. You start finding more and more evidence, and sometimes that example is going to turn out to be, quite the outlier, but usually it won't be. So it's a good approach for science. The anthropic principle often sounds a bit more alien because it's the assumption that you as an observer are only observing this event the way it is. The odds of you observing it are directly impacted by the fact that you can observe it. And that can sound kind of arcane, but we do this all the time. Let's say I wake up in a hospital, and I look around and I see everybody is wearing the same kind of clothing as me. Well, why are they doing that? They might be all wearing that because, again, I'm in a hospital and they are all wearing doctor's uniforms, which makes sense, right? But the only reason I'm observing all those people wearing doctor's uniforms is because I'm in a hospital, and I, as an observer, am only seeing them because, again, I'm in a hospital. Or I might wake up and everyone around me is wearing military uniforms or sports uniforms, and they're my friends from the military or from that sports team, and they'll keep an eye on me right now because I just got a head injury. So it's statistically more likely for me to observe them. Same as if anyone goes into comments on you or my channel, you're going to find a lot of people there are really into science fiction and science. Disproportionately so. That's not a coincidence, A lot of times, though, when you're seeing an event, you want to apply the mediocrity principle, but frequently the anthropic one makes more sense, that the odds of you observing that event are very related to who you are. Another example being that, 7 billion people on this planet, your odds of meeting your soulmate would seem to be statistically astronomically low. But they're really not so much so, since your soulmate's going to be somebody who has a lot of shared interests with you, which means you're much more likely to actually bump into each other. You both have a great big love of this comic book. It's one of the things that bonds you together. You're much more likely to be there when that thing is coming to town for a signing, right? That's the anthropic principle on a day-to-day basis. But the examples can be a little bit more arcane because we always have to use ones where you can't gather data. The mediocrity principle and the anthropic principle are both principles that you use when you don't know anything at all. Same as the principle of indifference, right? When you don't know anything at all. Normally you can gather more evidence and find out. So all the examples are for things where you cannot possibly find any evidence. And simulation argument is exactly one of those. You can't gather any evidence that you're inside a simulation. Same for the fine-tuned universe thing, which says the odds of all the various physical constants being exactly what they need to be for life to exist seem to be astronomically tiny. So for you to be in one to observe it is very improbable, but the only way you would actually know that it's improbable for you to observe it is if you are alive to observe it. Whereas all those other universes where life doesn't exist, nobody's there to notice that this is exactly normal. This is what the average would be. That's the anthropic principle in a nutshell. It often comes off, arcane to people, but it isn't. It's just the acknowledgement that the odds of you observing an event can be affected by you yourself. That your ability to be there to observe it is based on who you are, what you are, etc. The odds that you're reading something about, you've encountered a book that is on a topic that you find interesting is not that strange, since you just happen to be in that section of the library that has books that you find interesting. So there you go, you found that book. It wasn't that random.
Now let's briefly step out the territory of ancestor simulations into other hypotheticals. For example, if you had an infinite universe, that's not this one. The idea that was put forth, a thought experiment by Boltzmann, was that a Boltzmann brain could form a randomly conscious something, whether it's a brain or a supercomputer or some kind of conscious thinking. Mm-hmm. If such a thing woke up in a completely dead universe, a dead and infinite universe that long ago experienced its Big Bang and all the stars they're just iron stars at this point, there's just nothing there. Might it turn to a simulation in order to create a reality for itself? It goes into virtual reality. Could we be the fever dreams of an insane computer in another universe?
It's quite probable. And that's the thing is, and here's a big difference. This is why that ancestor simulation came up earlier. The difference between an ancestor simulation and another simulation. You can look around the universe around us and say evolution is much more likely to occur here than a Boltzmann brain is, which is true based on the physics that we can see, right? Therefore, we are probably not a Boltzmann brain. They are possible to occur, but based on the universe around us, they are much less likely than evolution. Problem is, if you're in a fever dream, if you're in just a classic dream or simulation, not an ancestor simulation, but just a simulation, you do not know what the rules are of the universe simulating you. And so we can say, what's more likely to exist? A universe, a gigantic universe, a gigantic supercomputer, or one that's only about as smart as you and me? Statistically, one that's just smart enough to be capable of dreaming should be the most common. And of course, ones that are even more simplistic would be too, but they're obviously not dreaming up complex universes. So the most power of the Boltzmann brains is just a human-level brain, or something relatively parallel to it, that's evolved and has gone insane, which is never really all that hard of a self-evolve, because you're thinking about something that's evolved without eyeballs. It has no eyeballs, per se. It's got no sensory organs, per se. It might have evolved, it might have had those happen just by accident, but the critical thing is it's most likely to not have them because it's just a random assemblage of thinking components. And so the odds of it just happening to have eyeballs too is pretty small. So here you have somebody in the extreme sensory deprivation mode. Whatever the physical laws of their real universe are, they start dreaming up crazy fever dreams of their own, and that's you. Now, if you are a much more powerful computer, as it were, a much bigger Boltzmann brain, yes, you might simulate whole worlds too, but you'd have way less of those than you'd have those single individual minds, just statistically, because it's so much more likely to have a small one evolve. Pop up. They're specifically not evolving. So in that context, the Boltzmann brain is looking at the probability that you might be a crazy mind in a void somewhere or dreaming all this stuff up. And again, as I mentioned, this is usually not that hard of a sell for most folks to believe. But the thing is, you can't speak to the probability of how likely it is compared to evolution, because this is a make-up universe. It's not an ancestor simulation. It's not one purposely built to look like the real world you came from, because the real world you came from is emptiness, utter dark sensory deprivation. Whatever those rules happen to be, for that universe, maybe it's more likely they are. We can't tell because we don't know what the real rules of the universe are, just the ones we dreamed up.
For another scenario related is, people ask that question that you mentioned earlier, that, why is it some people have to suffer so much, and lead, why does an infant die in a war? What was the point? Things like that. Could we be, related to the Boltzmann brain, could we be in a Roko's Basilisk scenario?
That one, probably not. The Roko's Basilisk one is it's a great example of acausality. For those who aren't familiar with it, Roko's Basilisk is the notion that you could resurrect the dead if you could just back calculate all of their data to, scan their mind in, as it were, by tracking backward on all the damage that had been done to it and finding out what it looked like at the moment of death. And that way you could resurrect the dead. Now, that doesn't work, and we'll get that in a second, but the follow-up of that being an AI could then have a motivation, a really powerful singularity, for instance, that was able to do that kind of resurrection, to torture people that it had resurrected. The reasoning being that it wants to exist, and it knows that it will have made its existence more likely in the first place if people were afraid to interfere in its creation having ever happened. It's not actually engaging in time travel, but if it can logically come up with a reason why it would torture people who don't know it exists yet but could exist, have a reason to be afraid that would happen to them, that they'd be resurrected long later when this thing came into existence and tortured for not having helped it to come into existence. And that's Roko's Basilisk. And of course it's gotten quite the reputation because it was just a bit of a thought experiment that everyone disagreed with at the time, but everyone thought it was taken more seriously. Because you weren't even allowed to talk about Roko's Basilisk, because the moment you talked about Roko's Basilisk, you were basically promising yourself torture if you didn't try to help the computer come into being. Now, the reason why that's not a threat is that even in a non-quantum universe, you cannot backtrack particles that accurately. If you have a frozen brain, sure, if it's frozen. If I incinerate you right now, every particle in your body is going to be breathed in by other creatures. They're going to walk around, eat, live, die, excrete, exhale, etc. You're not going to track all those particles. And it's pretty easy to demonstrate that even in a completely mechanistic universe, you need a computer way bigger than the universe to have a chance of even calculating one small planet. So it's not going to happen under any sort of known physical system. That does have a bit of a different takeaway, though, in context of a Boltzmann brain, because you don't actually know what the rules are that govern the simulated universe. But that comes back to the other one is, I don't feel like I live a tortured existence, so I can't really be being tortured by Roko's Basilisk, because it's very smart. It should know how to torment me quite well. And it doesn't appear to be doing very well at it if it is. If I'm a resurrected
incompetent
mind,
supercomputer.
Yeah. It's always, and it comes up with so many is when you're looking at behavior like that, you'll say, if this is their motivation, and this is the behavior that's allegedly, the reward that we absorb is the byproduct of that motivation. Isn't there several other better ways to do it? And they don't necessarily have to use the best way. Just to say, is this one they're doing stupid? And if this is a universe where someone's trying to torture me, they're really bad at their job.
Indeed. Now, one last question for you, Isaac. Now, we both do very, very similar jobs and deal with a similar subject matter, which involves contemplating things like Roko's Basilisk.
Is there anything
in any of this, is there anything that really spooks you?
If you'd asked me at previous times, maybe yes, but I've kind of come to the opinion that when it comes to a lot of the existential thought, you bring into it your own mindset. If you go into a lot of these things pessimistic or depressed, you're going to look at these existential problems and they're going to get you that way. If you don't go into it that way, then you don't feel depressed by a lot of these things. But there's really nothing that I've absorbed thus far or really thought about that I didn't come out with a, well, that's okay kind of thing going on. The universe might come to the end one day, but even then you say, well, what about entropy? That's going to kill us off one day. And say, well, in a non-entropic universe, you eventually kind of end up dying anyway and getting resurrected infinitely because you're just repeating over and over again. Anything that can happen will happen. So if the universe doesn't fall down from entropy in that kind of system, and one that the Boltzmann Brain was originally suggested for, the steady-state universe, you will die, and by freak probability, something that is exactly the same memories as you have is going to pop up somewhere else in the universe, thinking that it had, just out of nowhere, with the exact same memories you had the moment you died, and think that it's just been resurrected. And from a functional standpoint, there is no difference there at all. And I say, well, that's a way of immortality that you don't get in a heat-death universe. And you say, well, the problem is there is a kind of a limit as to how long if I live for an infinite period of time, everything has repeated for me. I have overflowed in brains. I have an amount of storage data to keep my memories intact that would not fit inside the entire universe. The Library of Babel, basically, the infinite number of monkeys, that's my memory at this point. And you can't actually fit that in the universe. So no new content's being stored. It is the book series that never ends. And I want a very long book series for humanity. I'd love to see us still around, or something that had ancestry from, that was all descendants. I'd love to see us around in a quadrillion years or quintillion years, but the book does end one day, and there's nothing wrong with that. Stories have an end, And that's a very long time. So I feel like if quintillion years you haven't figured a way around that problem, it's not that big a deal anyway. It comes to it at some point.
Do you think that we could? If humanity lives billions, trillions upon trillions of years, and we're eking a living off of red dwarfs, at some point, or iron stars even, do you think that there is a way to escape? Do you think you can get out of the simulation? Or do you think that we're just simply stuck, and when we get to that point, we just give up?
I don't think that you'd ever give up. For one thing, anything that's lived that long is probably really good at surviving because it's gone long past the point where it might have suicided by legitimate boredom. I don't think of boredom as a problem for life extension. We're talking hundreds or thousands or even millions of years, but you start talking trillions and quadrillions of years. If you haven't decided to pack the shop up by then, you are one of those entities that's just completely obsessed with continuing to live. So you'd be doing it right to the very end. And the actual purpose was just try to keep on living. And that's fair enough. So everything that's going to be around at that point in time is either going to have enjoyed its normal lifespan because they just make new entities every so often, in which case there will be that last stage that has to give up, or there will be things that they just keep going to the very end because it's what they do. And, when you think about trying to find ways around entropy, anytime you start dealing with infinity, or even zero, these are concepts that start having loopholes, problems, plot holes, you would, into how we think about them. How could you ever prove you're an infinite universe? What is an infinite time like? If you were to travel in an infinite universe far enough, you would come across places that looked exactly identical to where you left. So you'd have no way of determining if you looped around or just kept going a straight line that repeated. The same is the case for time. So even if you manage to escape entropy at the end of the universe, you are still going to have to hit that eventual finite boundary where everything's just repeating itself. You've escaped entropy into a place where it doesn't apply. You got reversible computation, whatever it is, something that breaks entropy. Things begin to repeat. And you'll have to start sacrificing memory because you've run out of stuff to put that on anyway, so they'll start to repeat even faster, And if you are losing your memories, because you're sacrificing those memories to store new memories on, that's a type of death too. So again, it kind of comes back to that thing is, it would be great if we could find some way to escape entropy, but it doesn't really change the fundamental problem. You cannot have infinity for anything finite. It just doesn't work out. It's a different concept. It's ineffable, if you would.
Well, my biggest existential threat now is, the one that spooks me the most, is the prospect of having to come up with material for quadrillions of years of YouTube videos.
That's a problem I wouldn't mind having to suffer from. So,
True.
although ask me to get into quadrillion years.
Yeah, I will. I intend to. All right, Isaac, that wraps it up. We're out of time. This was a great conversation, man. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thanks for having me on, John.
Join us next week for the continuation of John's discussion with Isaac Arthur for a premiere episode with a live chat with John and the team. Make sure to hit the bell so you don't miss the show.
So, John, I heard that you got rid of the LeBaron.
No, Anna did.
You know, I had one. Not anymore, sadly.
Oh, you did?
Yes, however, convertibles do not do well in the winters here in Ohio.
That's a real tragedy.
Is it really?
It really is.